Nobody's perfect, but some people aren't even close, and that includes some of the most beloved figures in all of history.
Even the most celebrated names in history have a dark side that often gets undiscovered. These figures, praised for their achievements and historical contributions, had committed actions that were downright horrible. It's a reminder that greatness and cruelty can coexist, and you would not expect the names revealed in this video. From bigotry to racism, let's peel back the polished image and see why some respected historical icons were awful people. Because history isn't just black and white, it's messy and complicated. And knowing the whole story matters. Let's begin. Henry Ford. When people hear the name Henry Ford, most immediately think of the Model T or assembly lines. He's often celebrated as a revolutionary figure in American industry, a pioneer who helped shape modern manufacturing and car culture. But there's a much darker, less talked about side to Ford's legacy that deserves just as much attention. One of the most disturbing things he ever did was publish The International Jew, a deeply anti-Semitic set of writings that contributed to the spread of hate and bigotry both in the US and abroad. In the early 20s, Ford used his personal wealth and media platform, the Dearborn Independent, a newspaper he owned, to publish a series of articles that painted Jewish people as a global threat. These weren't just offhand remarks or isolated incidents. They were part of a calculated campaign that blamed Jews for everything from economic problems to social decay. Eventually, these articles were compiled into a 4-volume set titled The International Jew, which was distributed widely in the United States and even translated into multiple languages. What's especially horrifying is the scale and impact of Ford's anti-Semitic propaganda. He wasn't just some fringe voice shouting into the void. He was one of the most powerful and admired men in America. That gave his hateful views legitimacy in the eyes of many. And it didn't stop there. His writings influenced anti-Semitic movements worldwide, including Nazi ideology in Germany. Adolf Hitler himself praised Ford in Mein Kampf and even kept a portrait of him in his office. It's chilling to think that Ford's words may have played a part, however indirectly, in the horrors that unfolded during the Holocaust. What makes it even worse is that Ford didn't just promote these ideas in passing, he stood by them for years. It wasn't until the late 20s, after public backlash and lawsuits, that he issued a half-hearted apology. But by then, the damage was done. The books had already been printed and spread. The seeds of hate had been planted in the minds of countless readers. And Ford never really took responsibility in a meaningful way. It's hard to reconcile this with the image of a man who revolutionized transportation and gave rise to the modern car industry. Ford's publication of The International Jew stands as a permanent stain on his legacy. It's a reminder that even those who achieve great things can also cause great harm. The impact of his words went far beyond mere opinion. They helped fuel a global tide of anti-Semitism that would have deadly consequences. While we can acknowledge his contributions to industry, we should never forget or overlook the hateful ideology he chose to promote. And so is the next name who might be one of your favorite classic authors. The Ugly Thing About Roald Dahl. Roald Dahl is one of those authors whose name immediately conjures up magic, mischief, and a sense of childhood wonder. For many of us, his books were part of growing up. Matilda, Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, James and the Giant Peach. He had this incredible gift for storytelling, a knack for writing from a child's perspective, and an unmistakable way of blending dark humor with fairy tale whimsy. But for all the wonder and imagination he gave the world, there's an undeniably ugly side to his legacy, one that's deeply troubling and impossible to ignore. Roald Dahl made multiple public anti-Semitic statements during his life, and unfortunately, he stood by those views even when given the chance to walk them back. The first time people really noticed was in the 80s, when Dahl gave interviews where he said things like, "There's a trait in the Jewish character that provokes animosity," and claimed that even a stinker like Hitler didn't pick on Jews without reason. It was the kind of statement that makes you stop mid-sentence and go, "Wait, what?" He didn't say these things quietly or in private letters that were later unearthed. He said them in interviews, in newspapers, publicly and unapologetically. What makes it worse is that this wasn't just a one-off comment taken out of context. He repeated similar ideas over the years, doubling down on his prejudice rather than rethinking it. What's especially hard about this is that it clashes so violently with the values many of us find in his books. Dahl often championed the underdog. He created characters who stood up against cruel adults, corrupt systems, and unfair rules. His villains were bullies and bigots and power-hungry monsters. But behind the curtain, the author himself held views that were, frankly, ugly and discriminatory. It raises tough questions. Can we separate the art from the artist? Should we? And what do we do when someone who gave us so much joy also caused genuine harm through his words? It's also worth noting that Dahl's anti-Semitism wasn't some minor footnote in an otherwise blameless biography. Jewish organizations, critics, and readers have spoken out for years about the pain and confusion they've felt, knowing that a man whose work they loved also expressed such hatred toward their community. His own family, decades after his death, issued a public apology in 2020, saying they recognized the hurt he caused and deeply regretted it. That apology came late, but it was a step toward acknowledging the truth, instead of brushing it under the rug. So here we are, living in a world where Roald Dahl's books are still celebrated, adapted, and sold by the millions, while the man behind them remains a deeply complicated figure. Maybe that's the point. Maybe it's okay to love the stories while being honest about the person who wrote them. Dahl's anti-Semitic views don't erase the magic of his writing, but they do cast a shadow over it. And it's only fair, especially to those hurt by his words, that we talk about that shadow openly. After all, being honest about our heroes doesn't make their art less valuable. It just makes our understanding of them more complete. The dark side of Coco Chanel. When most people think of Coco Chanel, they picture elegance, revolutionary fashion, and that little black dress that became an eternal symbol of style. She changed the world of fashion forever, there's no denying that. But behind the luxury, pearls, and perfume lies a much darker side to her story, one that often gets brushed under the rug. While she's celebrated for her creativity and independence, Coco Chanel also had a troubling past, involving close relationships with Nazi officials and even accusations of espionage during World War II. Let's rewind to the 30s and 40s, a time when Europe was boiling with political tension. During World War II, Chanel lived in the Ritz Hotel in Paris, which, at the time, was also home to many high-ranking German officers. Among them was Baron Hans Gunther von Dinklage, a Nazi intelligence officer, and he wasn't just any acquaintance of Chanel. They were romantically involved. Now, it's one thing to fall in love during turbulent times, but it's another thing entirely to be seen collaborating with a member of the Nazi regime while your country is suffering under occupation. But it goes deeper than just dating a Nazi. Documents and research that surfaced later suggest Chanel may have been much more involved. In fact, she was registered as a Nazi agent under the code name Westminster. Yes, like the British Duke she also once had a fling with. According to declassified French and German intelligence records, Chanel reportedly participated in a Nazi mission known as Operation Modellhut, which aimed to create secret peace negotiations between the Third Reich and Britain. Some historians argue she was trying to use her connections for her own benefit, like attempting to use Nazi laws to gain full control of her perfume business, Chanel No. 5, by ousting her Jewish business partners. It's disturbing, honestly. While millions were being persecuted, Chanel was apparently using her relationship with Nazi officers to gain personal advantage. That's not just opportunism, that's complicity. And yet, after the war, she managed to escape any serious consequences. She was briefly arrested by the French authorities, but was quickly released. Many believe her high society connections, especially Winston Churchill, helped protect her from deeper investigation and potential punishment. What's even more fascinating and disturbing is how quickly the world seemed to forget this part of her past. After a short, self-imposed exile in Switzerland, she returned to France and relaunched her brand, regaining fame and fortune. It's like the war and her Nazi ties were a mere footnote in her otherwise celebrated life. That raises all kinds of questions about how history remembers powerful people, especially when they leave behind a legacy wrapped in glamour and perfume. Of course, people are complicated, and no historical figure is ever completely black or white. Chanel grew up poor, fought her way into a male-dominated world, and undeniably changed the fashion industry forever. But brushing aside her wartime activities simply because she created beautiful clothes and timeless perfumes is dangerous. It's important to look at the whole picture, the good and the bad, especially when someone has had such a massive cultural impact. Another ugly truth is about to come out in the open, and you would not believe how racist he was back in time. Woodrow Wilson. There's another side to Wilson that often gets glossed over, and it's not pretty. In fact, it's downright awful. Beneath all the talk of democracy and peace, Wilson had some seriously disturbing views and policies when it came to race, and he actively made things worse for Black Americans during his presidency. Not only that, but he surrounded himself with people who held racist and anti-Semitic beliefs. And he did little, if anything, to challenge them. If anything, he encouraged them. One of the most disgraceful things Wilson did was resegregate federal offices. Before he took office in 1913, many federal workplaces were integrated, at least to some degree. Black and white employees often worked in the same spaces, even if racism still existed in subtler forms. But Wilson, instead of pushing progress forward, decided to throw it in reverse. His administration introduced segregation into federal departments, putting up literal screens to separate black workers from white ones. In some cases, black employees were demoted or fired simply because of their race. This wasn't a matter of keeping the status quo. Wilson actively made things worse, and he justified it by claiming it would reduce friction between races. That's a weak excuse for what was clearly a racist policy. Wilson's actions weren't just about federal office spaces. He also appointed openly racist individuals to key government positions. One of his most notorious appointments was Thomas Dixon Jr., a close friend and the author of The Klansman, a novel that glorified the Ku Klux Klan. That book became the basis for the 1915 film The Birth of a Nation, which Wilson not only screened at the White House, but reportedly praised as like writing history with lightning. Whether or not he actually said those words, the fact remains that the film was shown with his approval, and that film was basically propaganda for the KKK. The result? A huge spike in Klan membership across the country, fueled by the legitimacy the film gained from being shown in the White House. And let's not forget Wilson's track record when it came to speaking out against racism or anti-Semitism. He didn't. In fact, he seemed comfortable with it. He tolerated and promoted people who held extreme views, and he never used his position to condemn the violence and discrimination faced by Black Americans, especially in the South. Lynchings were still horrifyingly common during his presidency, and Wilson stayed silent. He had the power to speak out, to lead, to push for justice, but he didn't. And that silence speaks volumes. John Lennon. John Lennon is remembered today as a symbol of peace love, and artistic genius. But his journey to that point was far from smooth. Early in his career, especially during the height of Beatlemania in the 60s, Lennon made several remarks that sparked major controversy. Probably the most infamous was when he said that the Beatles were more popular than Jesus. At the time, Lennon was reflecting on what he saw as the decline of religion's influence in society and how young people seemed more interested in pop culture than spirituality. He wasn't trying to insult anyone, at least not intentionally, but the comment caused a massive uproar, particularly in the United States. Radio stations banned Beatles songs, fans burned their records in public, and Lennon had to make a public apology. It was one of those moments where a flippant remark turned into an international scandal. But that wasn't the only time Lennon's words got him into trouble. In his younger years, especially in interviews, he had a tendency to be sarcastic, biting, and sometimes downright offensive. He could be brutally honest, often without thinking about how his words might affect others. Some of his early statements and lyrics included language that would definitely raise eyebrows today, remarks that came across as sexist or dismissive of serious issues. It's important to understand that he was very much a product of his time, growing up in post-war England with a tough childhood and a quick wit that sometimes turned mean. Still, those comments didn't age well, and many fans and critics have looked back on them with discomfort. What's interesting, though, is how much Lennon changed over the years. After the Beatles broke up in 1970, he entered a very different phase of his life. A lot of that had to do with his relationship with Yoko Ono, who opened his mind to new ideas about art, activism, and self-reflection. He became deeply involved in anti-war protests and social causes, using his platform to speak out against violence and injustice. Songs like Imagine, Working Class Hero, and Give Peace a Chance weren't just catchy, they carried real messages. Lennon even spent time in therapy, including a method called primal scream therapy, which helped him dig into some of the emotional pain and trauma he'd been carrying for years. You can hear that raw vulnerability in his solo work. By the late 70s, Lennon had taken a step back from the spotlight to focus on being a father and living a quieter life. It's clear that he grew not just as an artist, but as a person. He didn't pretend to be perfect, and in many interviews, he acknowledged his past mistakes and tried to learn from them. That's part of what makes him such a compelling figure. He wasn't some flawless hero. He messed up, sometimes in big ways, but he also grew, reflected, and changed. In a way, his story is a reminder that people are complicated, and that growth is always possible. P.T. Barnum, a legacy entwined with racism and ethnically insensitive exhibitions. Phineas Taylor Barnum, popularly known as P.T. Barnum, is remembered by many as a pioneering showman and entrepreneur who revolutionized the world of entertainment. Often credited with popularizing the modern circus and museum-style exhibitions in 19th century America, Barnum is frequently portrayed as an innovative marketer and master of spectacle. However, beneath the glittering facade of the greatest show on earth lies a troubling legacy of racism and ethnically insensitive exploitation. Barnum's success was in many ways built upon a foundation of degrading racial stereotypes, the commodification of human beings, and the manipulation of public ignorance and prejudice. One of the most egregious examples of Barnum's racial insensitivity, and indeed human exploitation, was his exhibition of Joyce Heth in 1835. Heth was an enslaved African-American woman whom Barnum falsely claimed was 161 years old and the former nurse of George Washington. At the time, Barnum was only 25 years old and struggling to make his mark in the world of entertainment. Seeing an opportunity to captivate and shock audiences, he leased Heth from her owners and put her on display in various cities, charging admission for people to gawk at her frail body and hear her recount supposedly first-hand tales of Washington's infancy. This exhibition was not only a lie, but also a grotesque spectacle that capitalized on antebellum America's morbid fascination with slavery and black bodies. Heth, nearly blind and paralyzed, was paraded across the country while Barnum profited immensely from her suffering. After her death, Barnum did not afford her dignity in death either. He promoted a public autopsy, charging spectators to watch as doctors examined her body to verify and ultimately disprove the age claim. The autopsy revealed that she was around 80 years old, another confirmation of Barnum's hoax. This episode is a glaring example of how he exploited racialized narratives and the dehumanization of black individuals for financial gain. In the new generation, Barnum could have become viral and bashed over the internet. Barnum's racist exhibitions were not limited to Joyce Heth. Throughout his career, he capitalized on ethnological exhibitions which displayed people from non-Western cultures as exotic curiosities or living specimens of primitive humanity. These exhibitions often blurred the line between education and entertainment, but were deeply rooted in colonialist and white supremacist ideologies. They reinforced a Eurocentric worldview in which non-white people were depicted as inferior, uncivilized, or even subhuman. One notable example is the exhibition of so-called freaks and savages from Africa, Asia, and the Pacific Islands. Barnum showcased individuals such as Chang and Eng Bunker, conjoined twins of Thai origin, and numerous other non-white performers whom he often presented in highly stereotyped or fictionalized ways. His museum also included what he called the What Is It exhibit, which featured African-American men portrayed as missing links between humans and apes, perpetuating deeply harmful and pseudo-scientific ideas rooted in scientific racism. The context in which Barnum operated was one of entrenched racial hierarchies. The 19th century was an era in which phrenology, eugenics, and other racist pseudosciences were widely accepted by mainstream society. Barnum leveraged these ideas, consciously or not, to create spectacles that reaffirmed white superiority and catered to the prejudices of his largely white audiences. Barnum's exhibitions were, at their core, about commodifying difference. Whether it was physical, cultural, racial, or national, difference was something to be displayed, exaggerated, and sold to the public. In doing so, Barnum normalized the idea that people from non-European backgrounds were inherently strange or amusing, reinforcing systems of othering that would have lasting impacts well beyond the circus tent. This commodification was not without real-world consequences. Barnum's exhibitions contributed to the normalization of racial stereotyping and the objectification of marginalized communities. By promoting such exhibitions, he helped shape public perceptions of race and ethnicity in ways that aligned with white supremacist ideologies. Teddy Roosevelt. When people talk about great American presidents, Theodore Roosevelt often makes the list, and for good reason. He was bold, energetic, and full of ideas. He wasn't the kind of leader who sat back and let things happen. He made things happen. As the 26th president, Roosevelt came into office in 1901 after the assassination of William McKinley. And from the start, he shook things up. He took on big business, supported labor rights, and believed the government should step in to make society more fair for the average person. He was a key figure in the progressive era, a time when Americans were pushing back against corruption, inequality, and the growing power of giant corporations. Roosevelt believed in what he called a square deal, that every American should get a fair shot, whether they were rich or poor, powerful or powerless. He went after monopolies with antitrust laws, protected consumers with food and drug regulations, and helped establish national parks and forests that still exist today. In a lot of ways, Roosevelt helped shape the modern role of the presidency as a force for social and economic reform. But here's the thing, even though Roosevelt was progressive in some ways, he was far from progressive in others, especially when it came to race and culture. This is where his legacy gets more complicated. Roosevelt lived in a time when racism and imperialism were common, and while he didn't invent those ideas, he definitely didn't challenge them much either. In fact, he often embraced them. Roosevelt was a strong believer in the idea of American exceptionalism, the belief that the United States was not only special, but had a duty to spread its values around the world. That might sound patriotic on the surface, but in practice, it often meant imposing American control on other nations and justifying it by claiming the U.S. was civilizing supposedly less advanced people. Take the Philippines, for example. After the Spanish-American War, the U.S. took control of the Philippines, and many Filipinos resisted. Roosevelt fully supported the American military effort to crush the resistance, calling it necessary to bring order and progress. He described Filipinos and other colonized people using patronizing and sometimes openly racist language, suggesting they were not capable of self-government and needed the U.S. to guide them like a parent does with a child. This kind of thinking was rooted in what we now call white supremacy, the belief that white Western people were inherently better than others and had a right to rule them. Roosevelt wasn't shy about saying he thought certain races were more fit to lead than others, and that's a view that hasn't aged well at all. Back in the U.S., Roosevelt's record on racial equality was also a mixed bag at best. One of his most famous moments involving race came in 1901, when he invited Booker T. Washington, a prominent black leader, to dine at the White House. At the time, this was a bold move. It was the first time a black man had been invited to a formal dinner there. It caused outrage among many white Americans, especially in the South. Roosevelt defended the decision publicly, but he never did it again. And over time, he seemed to distance himself from more direct support of racial justice. For example, when black soldiers were accused of a shooting incident in Brownsville, Texas, in 1906, a case with very little evidence, Roosevelt dishonorably discharged more than 150 of them without trial. That action caused outrage in the black community and is now seen as one of the low points of his presidency. Roosevelt also didn't do much to support Native American rights. In fact, he once said, "I don't go so far as to think that the only good Indian is a dead Indian, but I believe 9 out of 10 are." While that statement may have been partly sarcastic or rhetorical, it still reflects a deeply dismissive and harmful attitude toward Native peoples. Roosevelt supported policies that continued to take land away from tribes and assimilate them into white American culture, often through boarding schools that stripped away language, religion, and tradition. His conservation work, which is often praised, also had a darker side. The creation of national parks and forests sometimes meant forcing indigenous people off their ancestral lands, all in the name of protecting nature, for mostly white tourists and future generations. When you look at Roosevelt's life and legacy, it's clear he was a man of contradictions. On one hand, he was passionate about fairness, justice, and reform. He believed in using the power of government to help ordinary Americans and to take on corporate greed. He gave speeches about equality of opportunity, and he genuinely wanted to create a better society. But on the other hand, his vision of who deserved those opportunities was often limited by race, culture, and nationality. He didn't see all people as equally deserving of rights or respect, and that shaped both his policies and his rhetoric. Che Guevara, Ernesto Che Guevara, is often remembered as a revolutionary icon and a symbol of anti-imperialism and socialist resistance. His image has adorned posters, T-shirts, and political campaigns, earning him a place in the pantheon of 20th-century revolutionary figures. However, Beneath the mythologized image lies a more complex and, at times, troubling individual. In particular, Guevara's early writings include disparaging remarks about multiple ethnic groups, including Jews, which raise questions about his views on race and ethnicity. A close examination of these writings challenges the sanitized portrayal of Guevara and demands a more nuanced understanding of his ideology and legacy. In his early travel diaries, notably the Motorcycle Diaries, Guevara made several comments that today would be recognized as deeply problematic. For example, during his travels in Latin America, he referred to black people in derogatory terms and described them as indolent and lazy. Similarly, he characterized Mexicans as a band of illiterate Indians. Perhaps most disturbingly, he also made anti-Semitic remarks, including stereotypical references to Jews as being overly concerned with money. While some defenders have argued these statements reflected the attitudes of the time or Guevara's youth and inexperience, they nonetheless point to a worldview that was steeped in racial and ethnic prejudices, at least during this period of his life. These early remarks are particularly striking given Guevara's later professed commitment to socialist internationalism and anti-racism. As a minister in post-revolutionary Cuba, Guevara often spoke out against racial injustice and colonialism, particularly in Africa, where he led a military mission to support anti-colonial forces in the Congo. However, the contradiction between his rhetoric and earlier writings cannot be ignored. It suggests either a significant evolution in his thinking or a troubling inconsistency in applying egalitarian principles. Critics argue that Guevara's racism was not merely a youthful indiscretion, but indicative of an authoritarian mindset that prioritized ideology over individual rights and dignity. The presence of racial and ethnic prejudice in Guevara's writings complicates efforts to cast him solely as a hero of the oppressed. While it is possible that his views evolved, the lack of public acknowledgement or apology for his earlier sentiments makes it difficult to fully reconcile his image with the values of modern anti-racism. Historians and scholars have increasingly emphasized the importance of critically reassessing figures like Guevara, whose contributions to political movements do not exempt them from scrutiny. By confronting these uncomfortable truths, we gain a fuller, more honest picture of historical figures and the ideologies they espoused. You reached the end of the video. Share your opinions in the comments section and subscribe to the channel for more uploads.